Hey guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we've got a great episode lined up for you, all about warm-ups. I think it's something that gets often overlooked and there's a lot of value that we can tap into that we don't make use of. So we're going to go through almost like a checkbox exercise of what you need to include in your warm-up to get the most out of it in the minimum time possible. But before we get into it, as always, a big thank you to our show sponsors, the Training Stimulus. If you're interested in leveling up your movement mechanics knowledge, please visit thetrainingstimulus.com and register your interest. Wit Fitness, please go to wit-fitness.com and use discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. And Hytro, use discount code LL20 to get 20% off your purchase. Rob, warm-ups. Yes. Pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, you just get under and start cracking on, don't you? You walk in the gym and say, right, what am I doing today? I feel like squatting. Right, let's get to the squat rack and go. That's it. Get your workout weight. I want to squat 100 kilos. Let's crack on.
Let's wrap it up. That's good.
Straight in. Now, I think it's something which I've noticed from talking to like clients and friends and people that aren't necessarily in the fitness industry, and they train, and the warming up feels like a waste of time to them because they're like, I just want to get in and get out, which is completely understandable when this isn't, say, like your passion and you love being in the gym. And some people are like, I do it because I have to, or just because I want to, really. But the warm up feels like a waste of time, or it's like, okay, quick couple of minutes on the treadmill or rower and I'm sweet, I'm ready to go. Now, I think that can be a valid way to warm up for a lot of people. But I think just like with most things, you end up hitting that ceiling quite quickly because then you're not primed for the work at hand. So then you're maybe leaving some strength on the table, or you're leaving some range of motion untouched because you're not priming the body. So, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. I know what you're going to say with this, like movement mechanics, more than warm-ups, but that's something that you can maybe include within your warm-up. So what do you think about warm-ups?
Definitely. I think it's a massive opportunity to improve your training. So on a surface level, people think of warm-ups as just like, oh, you should do it, you have to do it before you train, just because that's what good fitness people do. But actually, it's a real opportunity to set the body up to get the most out of your session. Obviously, reduce injury risk as well. But it's really priming whatever you need to get the training stimulus you want out of your session. And that's sort of what it all comes back to. And we're talking about it before pressing record. And I had a squash match yesterday, which made me laugh because the guy I was playing against was like, oh, do you mind if we have a little bit of extra time to warm up? Because I always get injured from squash. And he then proceeded to just like lie on the floor and do static stretches for about 5 or 10 minutes. And I was like, okay, that's probably why you're getting injured when you play squash. You're,
did you give him the key? Did you tell him that, do you know what, if you do what I'm doing here, you might actually not get injured?
No, I just did.
You let him do
it. It's a competitive match, so I'm not going to help him before it starts. It's 3-love win. Thank you. Yeah. And basically, and I guess comparing and contrasting that, I was doing court shuttles, just like running forwards, backwards, left, right, doing multi-directional lunges, obviously, rotations to get used to hitting the ball. And this sort of outlines one of the general principles of whatever the demands you're about to place on your body are, we want to replicate them and gradually build up to them. And we'll go through some general and specific advice on how to do that. But in its simplest form, that's what a warm-up should be doing. But that does depend on what the end goal of your session is as to how you go about doing it. So
I think this can get quite tricky, especially within, say, functional fitness, or just if you say train maybe like anterior, posterior, or like upper body, lower body, because you got pushing and pulling of upper and lower body muscles, right? Especially, I'm just talking about gym-based stuff. You might have explosive work, say you do some CrossFit, you might be doing some snatching and you do some gymnastics. So it's like, at what point do you what do you warm up for? Like if you're starting out with a snatch, then you go into some gymnastics and you do some accessories or whatever. Like, do you just warm up for the snatch and say, oh, the body's going to be warm, ready for the gymnastics? Or do you warm up for the snatch, then do some priming for the gymnastics? And, obviously I know we're going to break this down, but I think when it comes to, and I know this even from personal experience, I'm like, if I've got squats and I've got bench press afterwards, I'm not warming up the bench until I've squatted. And then I'm like, I'm warm enough now. So I'm benching, I go like bar 70. Yeah, okay, that's feeling good. And then what I then tend to do though is I tend to, if I'm feeling good after the squats, I'm feeling like, yeah, I'm ready to bench. And I start doing my first couple of sets as I'm priming. I'm thinking about, okay, what's not feeling 100%? Then I address what's not feeling 100% rather than then doing a whole bench warm-up, if you know what I mean, because then I'm obviously time dependent. So just like you mentioned there about you have to get specific to the stress I'm about to put my body under, but I've already primed the nervous system, say with my first lift, because I've taken heavy load. So my nervous system is a bit more primed for load, but movement is obviously which I then have to start becoming a bit more specific with.
Exactly. So I think there's two components to a good warm up in terms of, like, there's a general warm up and then there's a specific warm up. So for you there, doing your squatting could be classed as like a general warm up for your bench because your body's warm. Like, and in terms of like boxes to tick in a general warm up, we want to get the body moving. We want to get the heart rate and breathing rate slightly elevated, so you're starting to supply more blood and oxygen to the muscles. You want to get the joints moving so they start to secrete synovial fluid, which is basically lube for your joints, so everything just slides over each other much better. And that will happen just by moving your joints in to flexion, extension, whatever direction you want to go. So that's where the sort of old school basic cardio warm-up is really beneficial, because it will tick all of those boxes, and doing some heavy squats will tick those boxes for the bench because your heart rate and breathing will be elevated, especially if you've tried hard. But what it won't do is the specific joint motions that you're about to use in the bench. So as we get towards the specific side of the warm-up, we need to ask the question, what are we preparing the body for? What are the positions we're going to get into? What type of work are we about to do? So are we doing hypertrophy work? Are we doing like strength to power? Are we doing endurance or more of a cardiovascular stimulus? And depending on what those things are, we should go about things slightly differently so that there are no big system shocks for the body as we start to push ourselves, which is really the key thing. The body, if you give it enough notice, it can adapt and respond to almost anything. But it's when you have a really sudden aggressive demand that things can go wrong, and you're more likely to aggravate or cause an injury.
Yeah, I think that's key. I think a lot of people can probably appreciate and sympathise with the secretion of synovial fluid, because you go into the gym and you're just feeling a bit creaky, and you're like, oh, the knees are feeling a bit rough. Like you get into like a bottom of a squat, you're like, oh, because you've gone from standing or maybe sitting, and now you're putting yourself under tension in the bottom of a squat. So you're doing a couple of air squats, a couple of lunges. Like, okay, cool, here you go, body's moving. And, getting into using like some standard CV kit, especially things that aren't eccentric loaded, like say running, and using things like bikes, rowers, like the skis. Like those sort of movements are quite nice. They're less stressful. So you can prime that, unless you're going into a running session. That's obviously a little bit different, but we're talking obviously say gym based here, and getting that body moving, getting those joints moving. And like for me, I just want to make it clear, like when I said about how the squats warming me up for the bench there, I still then do some specific prep for the squats themselves. So that is then going to help carry over anyway to, being a lot more switched on through like, for the skill side of things, like for proprioception and balance and like, yeah. So let's get into maybe a bit of the specificity, because I think we all know about the general stuff. Just to be clear, I said some light CV stuff with ascending intensities. Obviously, not too much. Obviously, if your session if it's quite focused say, around strength, you don't want to be pushing too hard on the cardio stuff beforehand. And then, just I guess some full body movements.
Exactly. Yeah, I think the key there is just that nice ascending intensity. Like everyone sort of felt this when you'll do like 5 minutes of easy cardio, but it feels a bit hard. And basically that's because there's a lag from your body recognizing that you're doing some exercise to then increasing the heart rate and respiratory rate to supply the blood and oxygen, blood glucose and oxygen you're asking for. And this is why like the fittest people in the world can still get out of breath going up the stairs, because it's that change in going from resting to exercising and there's that time lag. And what you don't want is that time lag happening during the working part of your workout. Like if anyone's turned up late to a match or playing sport or anything and you don't do a warm up, you go straight on the pitch.
Yes.
And in the first 5 minutes, you're like, what's going on? Like, I have zero fitness. I swear I did this last week and I was all right. What happens? And that's basically that lag, because your heart rate and breathing have to catch up before they then start supplying adequate amounts of oxygen and glucose.
Yeah, I guess that's like why when we mentioned it in like the open episodes that we've done recently, like you want to be warming up that say some assault bike to start with, or some rower, like getting that heart rate slightly elevated. Then you start getting into a bit more specific movement for the workout that's about to happen, increasing intensities, doing practice rounds. So again, that heart rate's increasing even more, just so you don't go into that first workout. As I know some of us have all done, because we're trying to save that energy, and then bang, after a minute in, you're like, fuck, my body is, what am I going to do? And then you hold on. And that's one thing you don't want to be doing, is holding on to a workout, just waiting for the end. It's just miserable.
So, sorry, I went off on a tangent there. We're back to the specific warm-ups. So first box to tick, range of motion. So whatever the movement we're about to do is, we want to explore that range of motion required and hopefully go a bit further than it. And for bonus points, I'm obviously going to 3D it. So this is where like the stimulus 6 matrices come from. We're basically doing the movement that we want to work on, but exploring it in both directions in 3 dimensions. So doing squats with forward and back pulses, left and right pulses, right rotation, left rotation pulses. You're going to give all the joints in your body exposure to the positions they need to hit in 3 dimensions. But the way I think about this is you're almost expanding your comfort zone, because if you deviate from, in air quotes, the perfect position in the bottom of a squat, your body's already experienced it in the warm up, and it's crucially already experienced getting out of it in the warm up. So it's a double benefit here. And one of the other boxes we're going to talk about is proprioception. This is a form of proprioception. You're detecting movement away from center and away from ideal, and rehearsing the skill of bringing you back to center and back to ideal. So it's almost like the ability to dynamically stabilize a position. And there's a skill component to that, which by deliberately exploring the positions or the movement in those 6 directions, we are, like, to me, this is the best form of bulletproofing, because you're exposing not just your nervous system to it, but all your tissues as well. So your tendons and ligaments are getting exposure to suboptimal positions, and also developing the capacity to bring you back out of them. So that's definitely number 1 for me.
Yeah, and I can only just back that up with even my own personal experience, and from adding in 3D squats, so doing like as you just mentioned there, and focusing a bit more on the left side, because that's all the side that doesn't necessarily fully work as well when I am squatting. And when I do, which if you haven't downloaded the deadlift exercises you're not doing on the Lunge Lift website, head over and download your free copy now. But from doing the 3D deadlifts, they were really good at, after I'd done my back in, at just, again, exposing me to different positions, so that when I am going to the heavy deadlift, okay, I'm not priming my heavy deadlift laterally or with a rotation, but I have gone with those 5s and those 10s kind of into a rotation, and I've told my body, you're okay there. Just make sure you brace hard enough to pull back. And, I've exposed myself rather than just doing some Romanians and some deadlifts. Like, I've done more, and I've done a few other things, which we could actually dive into in a bit, but it's those 3D, like the 3D positional work, I think is such a game changer, because it just works.
So point number 2 is firing up the nervous system to maximize motor unit recruitment. So what we mean by that is, if you're about to ask for a lot of strength or power from your body, we've talked about this a few times. There's a concept whereby you're using essentially a percentage of your muscle's ability to contract. And very rarely are people able to recruit 100% of the muscle fibers in a muscle group, but we want to get as close to that as possible. So how do we do that? The simplest way to do it is just by lengthening and shortening the prime moving muscles that we're about to use. So like in the lower body, glutes, quads, hamstrings are the main muscle groups for most gym-based exercises. In the upper body, you're thinking lats and pecs for most push and pull exercises, and biceps if they're particularly big. And we basically want to get them lengthening and shortening in a specific movement pattern. So if it is a squat, it'll be slightly different to if it's a hinge, but also using some speed. And a more advanced technique is Supra maximal loading, where we actually go overweight. So this is where powerlifters will do things like heavy walkouts, so their body has experienced a greater weight than they're going to actually use for their working set. So when they go down to their working weight, it feels light. Or weightlifters might do overweight pulls, so they're going to pull a weight heavier than they're going to clean or snatch, so that when they use their working weight, it flies off the floor because it feels comparatively light. And those are just hacks to force the nervous system into recruiting more motor units than it would do at lighter weights.
Yeah, I think they're some of the things that I incorporate often, especially with my own training and clients that are looking to build strength, because like that going above your max, I think is something that's not used enough. And what I mean by that is like the walkouts in the squat, the bench press, right? They're the two, like the bench press, like having it in that rack, so having someone unrack it and you can hold it there. Because one thing I say is not only does that say prime you for your set that you're about to do, because you're about to drop down and it will feel easier and lighter, it also exposes you to weight that you want to eventually touch. Because like I said this to one of my clients who's going to be competing as well with me at the same competition. I said, like, we need to be doing walkouts with, say, 120%. Like we've been building up to, say, 120% of your squat. Because if you want to PB your squat, you don't want the weight to feel unknown. So you want to be felt like, what does that kind of weight feel in my back? Can I? Because holding 120% of your squat in your back rack, however you're holding your squat, is a skill in itself. Because you're how much you're having to brace and switch your body on, like that in itself, of how much you're having to ask your body to turn on. So then when you go to that, then your working sets that are going lighter, you're turning on and you're working hard for those sets, and it doesn't feel like you're working hard because you've already switched on. So you're not turning on muscles you haven't turned on yet. So yeah, I'm a big proponent of those. Right.
Yeah, and in a similar vein, so we've got going overweight. We can also go over speed. So this is where plyometric stuff and jumping without weights can get the muscles used to contracting very quickly. So if you've got a more power-based workout, then that's a great technique to fire up the nervous system to ask for faster movement. And if we apply this to like a sporting context, if you're running, you might run with a parachute to add resistance, which will be slower, but creating more force. And then you might run downhill, so your gravity is assisting you, and you actually turn over your feet at a higher cadence than you can actually create yourself. If you're thinking about something like a golf swing, you could swing with 2 clubs. So you've got a heavier club, so you're developing more strength and having to produce more force to swing the club. And then you might go for a club without a head, or just a short club, which is lighter than a longer club, obviously, and try and swing it faster to train the speed side of things. So in any sort of, it's beyond warm-ups. This is now like a training principle. You kind of want to go over and under in terms of whatever stimulus you're trying to drive. You ask for more in that direction, which inevitably means you need to give up something in another direction. So if you go heavier, you're going to have to go slower. If you go faster, you're going to have to go lighter, but you're developing the body to adapt in that direction as a result. And as long as we're conscious of it, we can train the body in whatever way we want.
Yeah, and I think even using jumps, like even if you're doing strength training, which might be technically, say, slower, like doing jumps before you deadlift, before you squat, is a real nice way to, as I say, just get things switched on and like, okay, cool, right, turn up. Because I can't remember who said it. I'm pretty sure it was like Ed Cohen, and he was just like, you want to be, when he warms up like for a squat, say, he treats the empty barbell like he would treat a top end weight. Like you want to move it with intensity and intent, because when you are doing that, when you get to those heavy loads, if you're thinking slow, you're going to move slow. And I've personally experienced this mid-session the other week. I was going for some squats and I was like, why am I being a little bitch about this? Like, I'm making this feel really heavy. And I was like, right. And I just said to myself, fast. So I squatted down, I did a slight pause, and I exploded out the hole as fast as I could. And I was like, oh, okay. I did that again. And then basically the rest of the session, I moved faster because I went in very lackluster. Like, I didn't do much of a warm up. It was a barbell warm up, just a couple of squats with the bar, and then like 70, 100, like that. So that was it. I hadn't primed myself. I hadn't told myself. So I hadn't told myself to move fast. Yeah. So I've gone in slow, and I was moving slow, and everything was feeling heavy. Whereas if I would have done this specific movement prep, that slowness wouldn't even been there, because I would have already told myself to move fast. And so why I'm saying this is because you can just mid-session, suddenly they say, no, sort your shit out and turn it on. You can. Yeah. But if you do it beforehand, there's less chance of, say, potential injury and stuff like that, because I started doing this halfway through my warm-ups. So it was like halfway, I can't remember what it was going to, but say I was around the 120 when I decided to, say, switch it on. I was like, right, no, sort it out. And that I could have hurt myself then, because I was, got out of position.
Yeah, there's a couple of things to say there that you just reminded me of. That if I was ever doing a heavy deadlift session and maybe rested too long, or things were feeling a little bit sluggish, something that I would do is just some moderate, fast kettlebell swings. So you just fire up an explosive hinge pattern, get used to moving quickly, and that would inevitably get you more fired up and prime that pattern. But that speed stimulus to the hip hinge was really useful. And you also reminded me of one of Gus's sayings, which is, you've got two choices. You can either make it look heavy or you can make it look light. Yeah. And I think it's a great way to think about those sorts of sets that you're doing with the squats. Like, if it's a sub-maximal set, you can make it look heavy or you can make it look light. And if your intent is to move it quickly, you're having more of a speed stimulus through the nervous system to rehearse maximal effort for the heavier sets. Whereas if you're doing just enough, that percentage motor unit recruitment is going to be lower, because you need less to move slow than you do to move fast.
And even just then, how the rest of the session felt, like I was so positive about the rest of the set, like how the squats were then feeling. I got to my working sets and I was just like, yes, this is how they're supposed to feel, because I knew what they were supposed to feel like, and they weren't feeling like that. And it was just like, I need to sort this out, because I can't go through this anymore, because this is just shit. So then as soon as you switch it on, you're like, right, here we go. And again, this is why I said, doing warm-ups, I think warm-up just has such an optional tone to it. Just say warm up, you can do. But it's like, I think when you start to experience the benefits of how doing some specific stuff, and even just general stuff to get the body moving, how much that will really help later in the session. So,
yeah, well, it's all training. It's all training. All of it's going to move you in the right direction. Even if it's not a hard working set, it's still asking your body to adapt positively. So, if you're feeling really shit and you go to the gym and just do a warm up, that's better than not going to the gym at all, because you've had some nervous system development, you've experienced the positions that you need to. So it's just refreshed your body's requirement to do those things, even if you haven't fully taxed yourself with a really hard session.
Yeah, and I think this moves us into like the skill part, because when you are, especially if you are feeling a little bit lazy or you're just not feeling there, like empty barbell, you might have to spend a bit more time there. Like with the snatch, I remember doing weightlifting, like if you snatch with the empty barbell, again, with intent, by the time you're moving up and weight, you want them to be looking the same, with intent, powerful, fast. And you realize that suddenly you're just in like that, like you've moved with such purpose that you forgot that you was feeling lazy, or you forgot that you was feeling tired, because it is just a state of mind that once you're in, that's why it's really easy to stay feeling lazy with just 5 minutes on the bike, because you can do 5 minutes like, I'm still feel shit. Like, of course you do. You've done fuck all. You just sat on the bike moving a little bit, like even on the assault bike. So whereas if you say, right, over the 5 minutes, I'm going to ascend in intensity. I'm not going to be max out at the end, but I'm going to be like 85%. So I'm going to be breathing heavy. Like, you then get off the assault bike there. That 5 minutes is the difference between a good session and a bad session.
Yeah, I think that's a great point in terms of the intent and focus. Like, as long as you know what you're going to be working on in the session, putting your mind towards that is how you can derive so much benefit. Like if you're doing empty barbell drills for weightlifting and you're thinking about your dinner, you're thinking about something else, you're not focused on the technical pointers that you're working on, you're not getting anything out of it. But if you're really focused on those technical pointers, that empty bar work might be the most productive time in your session, because you're rehearsing getting into the perfect position. And because it's an empty bar, you definitely can. But as soon as you start adding weight, it becomes harder for a lot of people to hit the right position. So if you're going into that work and exaggerating the demands of your limiter, so if there's a certain part of the lift that you always miss when it's heavy, but you're really doubling down your attention to say, this is what position I must hit every rep. Every time you do that, you're laying down neural pathways to say, when I'm at this part of the pull, this is where I am. And that is skill development. That's how your body learns a new skill. And only through repetition does that neural pathway get more ingrained and myelinated. Basically, a fatty sheath goes around the nerves so that they're used faster. The impulse goes along the nerve faster. That only happens through repetition and use of that same pathway. So the more you do it, the better you get at it. So, like, surprise, surprise. But even the empty bar stuff will drive that. So you can accumulate a lot more total reps than obviously working at high percentages. So it's a real opportunity to get better without adding huge amounts of muscle damage or fatigue, which increases your recovery demand.
Yeah, and I guess it's also like an optimal time to be throwing in some movement mechanics stuff that's going to prime you for your limiters that you may have. So say using the squat, or using the squat as example, because you might be squatting out of a snatch or whatever. Like, say your right glute might not be working as well. It might take a little bit more work to switch on. So you've got some certain movement mechanic work that get your body primed so that when you get to your squat or the snatch, whatever, that you can get out of the squat a lot more bilaterally rather than all through the one side. And, this all sounds incredibly obvious, but I think it gets overlooked. And I think that's and it gets overlooked, I think, by everyone. I think everyone that trains has had those sessions where they just, like you said, you just went into a game the other day and just had to start, run. It is, sometimes you have to do that, and you hope that your body's fit enough to do that, or you understand that when you are feeling like shit, like in the first few minutes, that it's because you've gone from 0 to 100, and that you understand it. So again, when I mentioned about with the heavy walkouts, like, you've experienced it, so you know what to prime yourself for. So when you are tired in the first few minutes, that's not you for the rest of the session. Okay, cool, I'm going to come back down and hopefully be able to break. Well, 5-side football is a bit hard because it's just go, go, go. So, yeah. But you might have an opportunity to kind of hang around at the back a little bit to try and get that heart rate back. But yeah,
that's it. And yeah, just to elaborate on the movement mechanics stuff, obviously that's one of my areas of passion, and yeah. I think I like to categorize it in with the skill work, because the way you move is a skill. So when you're doing those movement mechanics pieces, like Rob alluded to, where say you don't use one leg as well as the other, and you're rehearsing going into that leg, that is skill development. You're learning the skill of using that hip in that way for that movement, so that when you do your working sets, it's fresh in your mind to say, oh yeah, that's how I use my left glute when I'm squatting. And it's exactly the same as doing a weightlifting complex. You're making it easier for the brain to connect the dots from one motor pattern to the next, always bringing it towards your movement of choice. So whatever you're looking to train, your movement mechanics should lead you up the path towards that movement, rather than just being a generic mobility exercise. I think that's a really key point for the most efficient warm-ups, is they do that.
Yeah, and I think also when you're throwing in accessories to the main lifts, and I think you kind of look at this as two ways. So you can, if your goal isn't necessarily overall strength, and you just want to move, say, using a deadlift as an example, you might want to just make sure you're really getting some, especially with bodybuilding, you want to get good mind muscle connection in your hamstrings, glutes and back. So you might do a bunch of RDLs with some relatively moderate loads, so you are getting a training stimulus from that. And then you go into your deadlift, so that your glutes are switched on, your hamstrings, you've braced well. Your deadlift might be a bit you might not be able to hit the numbers you did hit because you've kind of pre-fatigued yourself. So that's pre-fatigue training. It's great for bodybuilding, but if you maybe go a bit lighter with those remainings and just doing it as a primer ready for the deadlift, then you've exposed yourself to those muscles so they know how to work even better when you then get into it. So you can approach accessories before your main stuff in kind of two ways that can kind of like switch you on ready for the work at hand.
Exactly. That's a great point. I think that just like getting a bit of stimulation rather than fatigue through those muscles. And you can obviously add a little bit more rest between them so you don't interfere with the main lift as much. But I think it's a great way to prepare the body for what you want it to do. So that in that example, that might be somebody who struggles to use their hamstrings or glutes when deadlifting. A lot of people are quite quaddy and backy. And if they did some RDLs before where it's easier to tap into those hamstrings and glutes, then they're probably going to be in a better starting state before doing their heavy deadlifts than not.
Yeah. I think also you can use like certain cardio kit, because we can obviously now move into like cardio in our warm-ups, because you know, if you have some upper body or even like some deadlifts, like doing some ski, so getting your lat switched on, your grip switched on, your midline switched on, do some ski erg before you're doing some deadlifts or some upper body work. Really nice way. Doing some rowing or some assault bike just to kind of get that total body moving, so getting that synovial fluid going, getting your heart rate elevated. So I guess one of the key things to maybe address here is understanding what intensities you're going to hit in the session and understanding how to warm up into it. Because I think, just like I alluded to earlier, where you have 5 minutes just ticking over, it doesn't really give you much. Whereas 5 minutes of intentful work where you're intentful, is that a word? Purposeful. I'm going to go.
I'll give it you.
I'll give it you, yeah. I'll give it you. So intentful work where you're building up for those 5 minutes and then you're getting yourself ready for your work in sets, whether that's in cardio or in the main sets, your strength sets.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I think this is especially important for a cardio session. If you're looking to do actual high intensity training where you're working close to max effort on like a cardio piece, you don't want the first time you've experienced a high heart rate to be in your working sets. So your warm-up needs to probably be a bit longer and a bit more progressive. Like the fact that if you're doing like a 10 by 500 on the rower or a 10 by 400 on the track, you don't want the first time you've experienced that pace to be in rep 1. You should have just had a little brief exposure to it. So doing some strides or some like 10-second bursts on the rower, just so your body's felt that speed already, even not doing a full rep, but also so your heart and lungs know what sort of rate they need to supply that oxygen and blood glucose. So you would probably want a longer warm up than that 5 minute progressive piece. And also, especially on the running front, if you're going to do some sprints, sprinting requires more range of motion through the hips, and obviously the plyometric demand is greater. So another reason to do sort of strides and skips, and obviously some nice long lunges to prepare the hips for that demand, because it's almost so common, it's laughable how many people do their first sprint session and tweak a hamstring because you know they haven't experienced that range of motion and that level of ground reaction force in their other training. Sprinting is a max effort activity, so you need to build up to it appropriately. So you probably don't want to do 100 meters all out for your first rep in your first session on the track, but unfortunately a lot of people do. So you progressively build up to it, progressive overload always.
I tell you what though, that just reminds me of like, so I did some track interval stuff with Brad like ages ago during lockdown, and we were doing some like I think we did like 1600s. I think we did 16, 12, 800, 400s, right? And I was like, I've never sprinted. I have, but I haven't really had access to like a track like this. And I was like, I'm gonna go for a sprint. And I was fine. I walked away fine. So I didn't end up hurting myself. But
that's a good result.
Yeah, but because I told myself, yeah, I'm nice and warm from the running that I've been doing, but I've been working at like, say, 70, 80%, not 100%. And I think this is key, because even if you're at 80%, I didn't experience what sprinting was. And I went from, say, 400 to then 100 all out. And there was no tweaking, I think, but I did have some terrible DOMs because it was felt like a tweak because I kind of pushed a bit too hard, but I was able to, it didn't hurt me too much, but I was definitely like, oh, I'm not going to do it. I did two. So I didn't do more than two, but yeah, it's definitely something that I think that exposure, and I think a lot of people are worried about is getting tired for the work that they've got to do. Yep. And I think I think you made the point there of like, if you're about to do some sprints, maybe doing some like short, like say 5-10 second bursts, like, or not some sprints, so like some 400 repeats or something like that, where they're quite hard, say VO2 efforts. You want to be working around that VO2 effort. So you've at least experienced that high heart rate with a rest and going back and down, because as we've alluded to this in this podcast is, if you go to that high heart rate too quickly, you just don't know how to deal with it. And I think that's where we can all become unstuck, is when we get worried and we're just like, fuck. And just like I mentioned earlier about like being in a workout, if you're not ready for it, it can really bite you in the ass. So
yeah, if you do that 10 by 400 session, you haven't got your heart rate up and breathing in the first rep, you're probably going to struggle to recover for the second, as well as if you had been there before, because you've got that lag we were talking about earlier, in that you've now created an oxygen deficit where you've used loads of oxygen without resupplying it as well. So you're in a worse position for rep 2 than you would be had you warmed up properly and increased the breathing rate in advance of rep 1. So I think that's a great illustration of why getting a bit out of breath before the working sets is a good idea.
Yeah, and I think if you're following a structured plan and you've got it's been periodized correctly, and getting too tired for the work at hand, as long as you don't do anything stupid, you're going to achieve that work because you've been prepping for that. So I when I said there, like, people are worried they're going to get too tired, it's, you most likely are not, unless you do something stupid. Like, you're probably better getting tired first and then getting into it, like we've said so many times. And it's just the reason why I want to keep hammering this point home is because I think it's so easily, it doesn't seem right, if you know what I mean. It seems like counterintuitive to get tired before you're going to get into the main work. But so I think to getting close to wrapping this up, but I think what would be really good to maybe identify is what's too much warming up, because I think we have two ends of the spectrum of people spending like 45 minutes warming up and not really maybe getting into some of the work and spending like 2 hours training, and then some people like myself the other day under the barbell and crack on, and potentially then getting away with it a couple of times, but then down the line, if I keep doing that, maybe exposing myself to potential issues. So what would be a good suggestion, would you say, for identifying how long?
It's a very much piece of string question, that it depends on the session and the individual. But as a nice sort of working rule of thumb, all the boxes to tick we've outlined in the episode, ticking those boxes with as little work as possible would be my advice. So if you can achieve those things in a couple of movements, then go for it. And this is where we start to layer multiple purposes on one piece. So if you're using the rowing machine, you're getting your cardio piece, you're getting a bit of a leg press, you're also getting a bit of a hinge. So you're getting more bang for your buck from a rower than you would be from a skier if you're about to deadlift, for example. If you're doing like, I'm trying to think of a good example here. So you've got a session where you're squatting and you're also, or you say you're doing overhead squats or snatch, you can obviously stack that into overhead squat prep. It also, if you're doing back squats and snatch, you can do overhead squat prep, because built into the overhead squat prep is squat work as well. It's not rocket science, but I think making those decisions and warming yourself up for the most demanding part of your session will have the most carryover, rather than just doing shoulder work, for example. You could just do it as overhead squat work rather than just shoulder work if you're getting ready for the snatch.
Yeah, I think something that I'd kind of throw in here myself is, even if you're like utilizing the row, as you said there, like doing it where you're hinge only, so you're not using your legs, doing arms only, doing legs only. So like if you do want to just do a lot of warming up on just the rower, you can isolate certain parts of movements to prime your hip, prime the pull, prime this. And I think, as like Ash said there, I'm a big fan of like complexes, like doing big things to kind of get that heart rate up. Even if you don't use any cardio kit and you're using an empty barbell and doing like a bear complex, like, doing some power cleans, front squats, back squats, presses overhead, like all in an empty barbell, like that's a nice way to get the body moving, and it's fun. And I think having fun in the warm up is part of it, because if you're like, especially unless you're a professional athlete, you need to do what you got to do. It doesn't matter if it's fun or not. But if you're already on the fence about if you do a warm up or not, do something that's going to be entertaining. Like, don't just sit on the bike or whatever for 5 minutes. As I said, get a complex in, do these movements, do some slams with some med balls, or do something different, because it's going to prime you in such a way where you then get into your work. You're going to have that little bit out of breath. You've been exposed to these multiple positions, which we've spoken about, like with the 3D movements, and you feel good. And it's just underrated. Warming up is underrated.
Agreed. So yeah, I think quick summary of the takeaways that we want you to leave with. Get clear on the key movement qualities and the stimulus for the session. So whatever the outcome of the session is, you want to reverse engineer your warm up from that. You want to build up to your working sets gradually and build up to the positions gradually to build a comfort zone around those positions. And that's where like the 6-way matrices come in. Think of your warm up as an opportunity for practice. So don't waste it. So whatever aspect of this training session has skill, like even if it's just basic strength work, there's still a skill component to it. So refining your motor patterns can be done during the warm up. And I think it's better to be too warm and a tiny bit tired than cold and unprepared. Obviously from an injury prevention point of view, but also from a performance point of view, you will actually do better well warmed up than starting from cold.
And I think just getting on the gym floor, lying on a roller, doing some stretching. I mean, so I'm probably going to go against Ash here and say, if you feel like that you need to do that to start your session, fine, crack on and do that. If you've got a good amount of time and you want to roll around on a foam roller and kind of get some movement going and then get into your warm up, do you? That's completely fine. But if you're someone that is a little bit more pressed on time or just wants to be more efficient with their warm up, maybe those bits of kit can be saved for other times of the day if you need to do, if you still feel you need to do that. But and I think one I can see you smiling there, right?
Yeah, if you've got, you're more than welcome to do that if you've got nothing better to do. But if you've got nothing better to do, then you probably need to ask yourself a question as to why you've got nothing better to do.
Yeah, and but I think as well, like one of the things that we touched on just there at the end, and I mentioned about like doing the complexes and stuff like that, where Ash went, doing something that you can do in the fewest amount of time, the least amount of time, and the fewest amount of movements. Combining things, doing lunges, doing complexes with the barbell, doing different things on bits of the cardio kit like legs only, upper body only, and so forth. And prep yourself for that task at hand. And it sounds really obvious, but it's just massively overlooked. So we hope you start warming up for your session. And if you do feel like, do you know what, I've taken away some of these points and gone, fuck, I had a good session there, we'd love to hear about it. So please tag us on Insta at lunge.lift. If you do want to support the podcast, you can head over to our YouTube channel and subscribe there. It's a nice free way to support us. We're building up. I think we're up to 100 subscribers now. It's pretty cool. I know, mate.
Easy heights.
Yeah. Looking at our statistics, there's a lot of you that listen and then aren't subscribed. So we'd really appreciate a couple of those extra subscriptions.
They're not good enough to look at, mate. I think that's the problem.
I think so. Well, you get to see me through the evolution. So, you've been Mr. Consistent.
His hair's still growing.
It's still growing. It's still getting there. So, but as always, we really do appreciate your time. Thank you very much. We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and we'll see you next week.
Cheers, guys.